Hey everybody, Dr. O here and welcome to USLO 2.4. Now in this learning outcome, we're going to be revisiting some information that we've already taken a look at. If you've already reviewed the video for 2.3, you'll have some idea of what a hydrolysis reaction is and what a dehydration synthesis reaction is. And you'll know that both of those involve the water molecule. So that's going to be old news, but we're going to revisit it and we're going to look at the role water plays in each one of those. And then for the rest of the unit, we're going to be looking at qualities of water. We're going to be looking at water's reactivity, how it reacts with substances. We're going to learn what heat capacity is and that water has a high one. We're going to learn about the ability of substances to dissolve in water. So we're going to be looking at water's solubility, and we're going to be learning about what aqueous solutions are, and then taking a look at saline and why it's important. And then the last quality of water we're going to be looking at is polarity. And we're going to be learning what influence this has on the body and how the body functions. So with that, let's get started. Now in this part of the unit, we're going to be talking specifically about water and its role in biological systems. And we just finished talking about hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis, but it involves water, so we're going to revisit those concepts here. So as we just saw, hydrolysis is when you're going to take a large molecule, your big honkin' AB, and then you're going to split it into A plus B. And as a result, in order to make that happen, you're going to take a water molecule and you're going to split it into a hydrogen and a hydroxide. Now, one portion of the severed compound is going to end up with that hydrogen, and the other part is going to end up with the hydroxyl group. And we could write the equation like this. And we have to have the addition of water in order to make this happen. Now, the dehydration synthesis, this is when we have a reactant A, and it's going to give up its hydrogen, and then we have another reactant B, and it's going to give up a hydroxide. And the result is we're going to end up with that big honkin' AB and a water molecule. So if we bring up that reaction, it looks like this. And here we have the creation of our water molecule. So we can see that in hydrolysis as well as dehydration, water is going to play a big deal. And we can kind of get a clue to that because hydro means water, hydra means water. So here we have hydrolysis, we're breaking up water, lysing water, and then here we're dewatering something, dehydrating it, removing the water from it. So there's that concept revisited. So let's look at an example of a hydrolysis reaction. So we consume carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are these, basically they're sugar rings that are bound together in a chemical reaction. So what we have here is one sugar ring, and it is bound to another sugar ring, and we're going to want to break this down in order to be able to access each one of these simple sugars. That's how the body likes to use these. So we're going to target this bond right here. And as the name implies, hydrolysis, that means we're going to use a water molecule, and when we break this bond, we're going to apply a hydrogen to one part of this and a hydroxide to the other part. So here is our reaction where we're going to use a water molecule, and then we're going to break the bonds between these two sugar rings, and we're going to basically put the hydroxide here. And this oxygen has to go somewhere, and let's say it ends up going with this molecule right here, then that's where our hydrogen is going to go. So we end up with a sugar ring with a hydroxide, and ultimately a sugar ring with a hydroxide as a result of taking that water and cleaving it in two. This is what's happening when we do those catabolic reactions, taking big molecules and breaking them down into small ones. Now let's talk about a dehydration reaction, and this is where we're going to take two smaller molecules and put them together to make a bigger molecule. Now I've left the formulas in place here because we're going to eventually be talking about these, so I thought why not give you your first pass at it right now. So what you're looking at are two amino acids. And I'm going to tell you what you've got. You've got all amino acids are put together this way. You have a nitrogen with a couple of hydrogens here on this end. You have a carbon that's bound to an oxygen and a hydroxide on this end. In the middle, you've got a carbon, and then you're going to have some sort of a side chain, which we're just going to generically call R, attached right here. Don't worry about that. Just know that there's going to be a whole lot more coming off here. Be lucky that we just calling it R1. And we want to bind this amino acid to this other amino acid over here, which is put together very similarly, where we have a nitrogen and a couple of hydrogens on this end, a carbon bound to an oxygen, and a hydroxide on this other end, a central carbon that's bound to this, whatever this group is, this other R over here. Now our targets in our dehydration are going to be this hydroxide right here. We're going to remove this hydroxide, and we're going to remove this hydrogen, and this is where we're going to get our water molecule. And when we do that, that means that we've got an empty space here where this carbon can bind to something, and an empty space here where this nitrogen can bind to something. So let's make that happen. So we're going to add these together in our chemical reaction, and here's our transformation arrow, and we're going to pull out the water molecule. And as a result, we can now bind these two molecules together to create the first part of our protein. Because basically that's what you're making. When you start stringing amino acids together, you're starting to make a protein. So this is a classic dehydration reaction. So we've learned that water can be involved in these two reactions that are pretty much vital to our physiology. So what else can we learn about water? Well, we can learn that water is the most abundant inorganic compound in the body. It makes up anywhere from 60 to 80% of the volume of our living cells. Babies come in at about 73% water. Now, by the time we get old, we do start to dry out a little bit. We can slip downwards of about 45% water, but the average comes in at around 60 to 80% in younger people. And water has these very important properties, such as high heat capacity, reactivity, solvent properties, and polarity. So let's take a look at why each one of these properties is important to the body. So we started off by talking about heat capacity. What is heat capacity? Well, heat capacity is the amount of heat supplied to an object in order to get it to increase its temperature by 1 unit, let's say 1 degree. That's how we would define heat capacity. Now, we've all had experience with this. For example, if you have an aluminum pan and you put it on the stove, we know that an aluminum pan can get hot really fast unless you have something in it. But if you just put a pan on the stove, it's going to get hot really quickly, and that's because it has a very low heat capacity. The heat capacity of aluminum comes in at 0.89 joules per gram degrees Celsius. So joules per gram degrees Celsius, you don't really have to worry about that. That's just the unit of measurement for heat capacity. So that basically tells us that if we take this aluminum pan and we put it over fire, it's going to get hot really, really quickly. That's one of the reasons why we like aluminum, is because basically it gets hot really quickly and it allows food to cook very quickly. Now let's say that we had a pot of water. Well, water comes in with a really, really high heat capacity. Comes in at 4.184 joules per gram degrees Celsius. That's really high. Basically, that means that you have to add a whole lot of heat to water to get it to move just the littlest bit. Which is why you can set an aluminum pan on a flame and it'll get hot within seconds. But it can take upwards of 10 minutes to get water to boil, because water can absorb heat and absorb heat and absorb heat, never change, absorb heat, absorb heat, absorb heat, start to increase a little bit. That's what we mean by heat capacity. The ability to just keep absorbing heat before a substance changes even 1 degree. That's heat capacity. So like I said, water has a really high heat capacity. Now, why is that so great? Well, it's great because as a biological living organism that's mostly made up of water, it helps me maintain a normal body temperature. That means that I can go outside in 100-degree temperature and still maintain my body temperature, because that water in my tissues, in my blood, and in my cells is just going to absorb heat without changing hardly at all. That is the beauty of having water make up most of the bodies. High heat capacity, resistance to change, helps us maintain homeostasis. Now, another quality of water that we like is that it has reactivity. What does that mean? Well, it means that water can readily react with substances and undergo chemical reactions. And in fact, water is highly reactive. And it is this highly reactive quality of water that allows it to undergo those hydrolysis and dehydration reactions so easily. So when we look at these reactions, this is our hydrolysis reaction and our dehydration reaction. The reason why these are able to undergo those reactions so quickly is because water readily enters into those reactions with very little enticement. It's just naturally reactive. Now, in the biological system, water is known as the universal solvent. So before we get into what what a solvent is, let's actually talk about what is all of that in chemical terms. So the whole idea is the creation of a solution. So what is a solution? Well, a solution is going to be the combination of solutes and a solvent. So what are solutes? Well, solutes are particles that are going to be dissolved in the solvent. And the solvent is the substance that is going to dissolve the solutes. So we can't really talk about solvents without talking about solutes, and we can't talk about solutions without first knowing what solutes and solvents are. So water is known as the universal solvent. Now this is from the perspective of biological bodies, such as human bodies. And water's ability to act like a solvent plays a big role in how the body responds to certain substances. So water is polar, and as a result of that, it has the ability to dissolve and dissociate ionic substances. So we saw that in this example where we take something like salt, and we know that if we put salt in water, it's basically going to make that salt ionic substances. So that is one of the properties of water as a solvent. Another thing that water can do is it can form these hydration layers around large charged molecules. So for example, proteins have areas of charge around them, and as a result, water will take a big protein molecule and incorporate it into itself and form this hydrating layer around that molecule. Water is also the main body's transport medium, and because of this, the things that we drop into the blood have to have a way to accommodate water's polarity, whether it is a substance that has its own charge or whether we put it with a substance that has charge. Because we'll do that. Some substances don't have any charge, like fat. Fat doesn't have any charge to it. So the way that we move fat around in the body is that we actually have to drop it into a structure that has charge, like an Uber, and then transport it around the body. Otherwise, it won't move very easily. So these are some things that we have to be mindful of when we think about water as a solvent and its ability to dissolve substances. So like I said on the previous slide, it's water's polarity that allows it to act as a solvent for substances that form ions in water, or substances that have a polarity or a charge somewhere on their molecule. So let's say that we have the example of salt. Here we have salt. And if we drop it in water, then what happens, the way that water incorporates salt, is that the water is going to pry the sodium chloride apart. And it does that by attracting the positively charged sodium to the negatively charged region of the water molecule, which is going to be around the oxygen. And it will attract the chloride, the negatively charged part of salt, to the positively charged part of water, which is going to be the hydrogens. And in fact, once we drop sodium chloride into water, the water molecules are going to rearrange themselves so that the positive parts of water are going to align with the chloride, wherever it is, and the negatively charged part of water is going to align with the positively charged parts of sodium, wherever that is. So this is how water dissolves, air quotes, dissolves substances. Basically, it just realigns itself so that its positive parts are aligning with the solute's negative regions, and the water's negative parts are aligning with the solute's positive regions. And here I'm showing you the example of salt, which is going to divide up into positively and negatively charged particles. But there are some molecules that are very large that will not divide apart, but they have areas that are positively and negatively charged, and water will do the same thing around those regions that are positively and negatively charged. Now, when we see this happening, we would say that this type of solute is hydrophilic. It loves it some water. Hydro means water. Philic means love. It loves it some water. Loves it so much that water just surrounds it with all of its little polarity love. And that's what we see happening with sodium and chloride. Little love fest going on. But there are substances in the world, there are substances in our body that do not have any areas of polarity, no charged regions, won't break down into charged regions. And an example of that is this molecule right here. Now I know it's going to blow your mind unless you happen to know what this is, but this is a triglyceride molecule. This is fat. And what do we notice? I see carbon and hydrogen and carbon and hydrogen, carbon and hydrogen, carbon and hydrogen, carbon and hydrogen, and an occasional oxygen. Now the deal with carbon and hydrogen is that neither one of them is going to strongly attract electrons. So carbon and hydrogen are going to share the electrons between them equally, which means that as a result, carbon's not going to have all the electrons, neither is hydrogen. And there will be no areas of polarity on this molecule. There will be no areas of charge on this molecule. Now, without any areas of charge, our little water molecule says, yeah, I don't think so. I don't know how you're going to make it in here. We have no way to incorporate you. Sorry. You need to stay out there. And in fact, that's what happens if we put water and oil together. We're going to see a separation. So if you were to dump oil and water together, eventually they're going to completely separate into two separate layers. And the reason why is because fats bear no areas of polarity. They bear no areas of positive or negative charge. And as a result of that, our positively, negatively charged water molecules can't do anything with them. And it basically forces them out. That's what we call hydrophobic. Hydro, water, phobic, fearing. So we would say that fats are hydrophobic. Fats are like, I don't want to play with water. Don't make me. And it doesn't. Now, there's one more interesting thing about water and its polarity and how the body deals with it, and this concerns membranes of the cells. So, cells are very much like we are. Like we have a skin that helps keep all of our stuff inside and then keeps certain things outside of our bodies. Well, cells are the same way. Cells have things that they need to keep inside to make them work, and then as a result, they have things in the external environment that they need to keep out. And so they have a skin too. We call it a cell membrane. And in the world of the cell, the world of the cell is a watery environment. And in the world of the cell membranes are going to be made up of these molecules that are called phospholipids. Well, we know what lipids are. Lipids are fats. But what is a phospho? Well, let's bring up a molecule and take a peek. Okay. Without getting too technical, this is our phospho part right here. Right here. We have a phosphorus molecule surrounded by some oxygens. Hey, where have we heard that before? Triphosphate. Yeah, that's where. When Mother Nature finds a system that works, she has a tendency to repeat it. And you're going to hear me say that a million times in teaching anatomy and physiology because I'm going to point it out every time I see that. So this is a structure that we see in ATP. This is a structure that we see in phospholipids. So what we have here is we have this phosphate group, and it's going to be attached to this lipid. And what makes this molecule special is that we have this phosphate part. Phosphate is going to have a charge to it. And as a result, that means it's going to be hydrophilic. So the phosphate head, which is what we call this, is going to be hydrophilic. It loves some water. It's going to play nice in water. But we have these fatty acid chains down here. And remember, all carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, carbon, and hydrogen, no charge. No charge. No charge means that it's going to be hydrophobic. So on one molecule, we have a part that loves water and a part that doesn't. That is the nature of phospholipids. Now, when we draw these, what most artists draw these, we actually just draw it as this circular head. That's where the phosphate lives, with these little dangly parts, and that's where the fatty acids live. So here's our hydrophilic region, and here's our hydrophobic region. And when we look at cell membranes, we see it represented by these structures right here. So let's take a look at one. So this is how cell membranes are put together. It's made up of two layers of these phospholipid molecules. And on one layer, let's say the outside layer, we're going to see all these phosphate heads that play nicely with water, facing out. Fatty acid tails that don't, facing in. So this allows the outside of the cell to play nicely with the watery environment of the body. But what about the watery environment inside the cell? Well, if we look, here we have inside the cell, and look at what the body has done. We have a phosphate layer, which is going to be hydrophilic, plays nicely in a watery environment inside the cell, but the hydrophobic tails are going to be pointing inwards towards the other hydrophobic tails. So basically, by creating this lipid bilayer, this double layer of phospholipids, we have created a structure that points the phosphate heads out, allowing it to play nicely in a water environment, whether that water environment is outside the cell or inside the cell, while at the same time creating a fat barrier that keeps things out of the cell and in the cell. That is the beauty of water's polarity and how Mother Nature has created molecules in order to create structures that can function in this watery environment that we call our bodies. And phospholipids play a big role in that. We see phospholipids all throughout the body doing different things. I'm giving you the example of cell membranes, but we actually use phospholipids for a number of things in the body. But now you have an idea of why phospholipids are so important, and it relies entirely upon the polarity of water and the ability of a complex structure, a molecule, to integrate into water. And with that, we're done with USLO 2.4. Thanks for watching.